I'm Taylor Downing, a historian, writer, broadcaster, fellow of the Royal Historical Society. For many years, I ran an independent television production company that specialized in the production of historical documentaries. We made programs for British, American, European broadcasters. But for the last 10 years, I've concentrated more on writing popular histories of 20th century events. I've looked at the impact of science on war in both the First and the Second World Wars. I've written about a little known Cold War scare in November 1983, when the Kremlin nearly launched a full-scale nuclear assault upon Western Europe and the United States. But I also write about film and history, and the history of television. And for many years, I've been writing a monthly feature for Military History Matters called War on Film, looking at the story of the making of classic war films and the impact they've had when they were released. In January of this year, I have a new book out, 1942, Britain at the Brink. And that's the book I want to talk briefly about today, at how the long run of military disasters through the year 1942, 80 years ago, generated a political crisis that threatened to undermine Churchill's wartime leadership of Britain. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, when asked by a young reporter from ITN what he feared most, replied, "Events, dear boy, events." We've all become aware in the last 18 months of the broad range of events that can cause political crises, as pandemic and national health alarms have led governments to take extraordinary measures. But in wartime, it's simpler. In a democracy, military failures lead to political crisis. What happens on the battlefield determines the success or failure of political leaders. And never was this more evident than in 1942, when a series of military debacle nearly overwhelmed Winston Churchill and his government. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, Churchill immediately and instinctively felt the war was won. With America and the Soviet Union as allies, the Prime Minister knew that victory one day was certain. On the evening in which he heard the news of the attacks by the Japanese on the US Pacific Fleet, Churchill was at Chequers, as his aides and secretaries rushed about, frantically sending messages to the Foreign Office, to the Speaker of the House of Commons to recall the Commons, to members of the government and other heads of state. A much relieved Churchill simply left the hubbub going on all around him and retired to bed. He later said that on that night, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. At that point, he had no idea of the disasters that would follow thick and fast over the next 9 months. Only 3 days after the news of Pearl Harbor, he received devastating news of the sinking of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse by Japanese bombers flying out of what had been French Indochina. He took it particularly badly because he'd ordered the ships to press ahead without air escort to provide a sign of British naval might that would act as a deterrent to the Japanese. He later wrote, "In all the war, I never received a more direct shock." British, Indian, and Australian forces in Malaya were soon completely overwhelmed by Japanese troops advancing rapidly down the peninsula. The Imperial forces were untrained for jungle warfare, and they'd been milked of their NCOs and their best officers who'd been sent to fight in the Middle East. They would build a defensive barrier across a main road, but the Japanese would move into the jungle, outflank the defenders, who would then be forced into a hasty and disorganized retreat before being totally cut off. Thousands surrendered, and vast depots of supplies, including dozens of vehicles, along with hundreds of tons of rations and ammunition, were abandoned. Before the impending disaster in Malaya could fully play out, there was further humiliation when 3 German warships, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenauer, and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, cheekily raced from Brest, where they'd been in for repairs, up the channel to return to their Baltic base. Hitler wanted them back in German waters. In broad daylight, they sailed right through the Straits of Dover. Due to a series of blunders and appalling failures of communication, naval destroyers, motor torpedo boats, the shore batteries of Dover, along with the Fleet Air Arm and RAF bombers, failed to score a single hit on the 3 German ships. The press were up in arms. The Manchester Guardian asked why the Japanese were able to sink the Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya, but the RAF and the Navy combined couldn't hit these German warships as they passed within miles of the White Cliffs of Dover. The normally loyal Daily Mail led the attack with a leader that was both anti-government and anti-Churchill. They asked, how was it that the Germans had achieved what the Spanish Armada had not managed nearly 400 years before? There was outrage at the humiliation. A group that I use a lot, or an archive that I use a lot in the book, is that of mass observation. This was a group that recorded everyday comments by people across the land. It used these and other data that they collected to provide regular assessments of morale for the Home Intelligence Unit of the Ministry of Information. Today, its records are held by the University of Sussex and offer a unique insight into the concerns and attitudes of British people throughout a tumultuous year of the war. Mass observers up and down the country wrote down some of the comments they heard expressed after the humiliation of what became known as the Channel Dash. In a corner shop in the Yorkshire town of Dewsbury, on the day the news came out, it was the one topic everyone wanted to talk about, according to the Observer, who wrote down verbatim in that shop what some of her customers were saying. What have they been doing to let them ships escape? They've made fools of us, haven't they? Said one lady. The fact that Britannia no longer seemed to rule the waves and couldn't even stop German warships passing within a few miles of the White Cliffs prompted complaints and indignation. A male customer commented, by gosh, it's time we bucked up, what with one thing and another. There's only the Russians doing out. They wouldn't have let them slip, you can bet. Another lady complained that it happened under our noses. Churchill was thrown into despair by the fiasco. Sir Alexander Cadogan of the Foreign Office wrote in his diary, and I quote, "The blackest day of the war yet. We are nothing but failure and inefficiency everywhere." Henry Chips Channon, who wasn't a supporter of Churchill, wrote in his diary of the attack by the Mail that it's the first time that has ever happened. But the public too were outraged by the humiliation, and Channon wrote, and I quote, "Everyone is in a rage against the Prime Minister. Rage, frustration. This is not the post-Dunkirk feeling, but anger. The capital seethes with indignation." 2 days later, there was even worse news when the garrison of roughly 85,000 Imperial troops surrendered to a Japanese force of about 25,000. Photographs of the Commander-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, walking out with a white flag to surrender, went around the world. Nothing symbolized British imperial collapse more vividly. Churchill saw the capitulation of the fortress at the heart of Britain's defence of the Far East as another terrible humiliation. In a speech to the Conservative Party Central Council, he didn't hold back. He said, quotes, "Singapore has been the scene of the greatest disaster to British arms. Singapore has been the scene of the greatest disaster to British arms, which our history records." When his daughter Mary visited Downing Street for a lunch alone with her parents a short while later, she found her father in a state of depression. "Papa is at a very low ebb," she wrote in her diary. "He's not too well physically, and he's worn down by the continuous crushing pressure of events. He is saddened, appalled by events." Not only were the press and many ordinary people outraged by the turn of events, but MPs were up in arms as well. Labour MP Frederick Bellinger told the Prime Minister in the Commons, quote, "There is in the country and indeed in the House at the present moment a feeling that we've not got the right kind of persons to direct this war to a satisfactory conclusion. We've not got the right kind of government." And at this point, according to Hansard, the House cheered. But more humiliations followed. British and imperial troops were once again routed in Burma. Another imperial capital, Rangoon, fell to the Japanese in March. The vital route to China was cut, leaving the overland route for overland supplies from the outside world broken. British and imperial troops withdrew first across the Irrawaddy River and then the Chindwin. Mandalay was captured on the 1st of May, and later that month, the remaining British, Indian, and Gurkha troops withdrew across the ravines, the jungles, and the mountains to the frontier of India. They crossed into India at the beginning of May, according to their commander, General Slim, looking as gaunt and ragged as scarecrows. It had been a disastrous campaign, and having covered 900 miles, became known as the longest retreat in British history. And the Japanese were now at the gates of India. When a Japanese naval task force of 5 carriers and 4 battleships sailed into the Bay of Bengal, it caused panic. In 3 days, 23 merchant ships were sunk. Many began to feel that an invasion of India was imminent. An Eastern fleet was hastily assembled, but it was no match for the Japanese Navy and their dive bombers. 2 heavy cruisers were sunk off Colombo in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and a light carrier and his destroyer went down outside Trincomalee. All the ships were lacking effective fighter cover. The admirals seemed to have learned nothing since the loss of Repulse and Prince of Wales 4 months before. Back in the Mediterranean, the island of Malta was under intense siege. The British naval base was put out of action in the early months of 1942. The cruiser squadron and the submarine flotilla based there withdrew. Continuous air raids, sometimes more than a dozen in a single day, devastated the 3 airfields, the 3 RAF airfields on the island. The city of Valletta was pulverized, its narrow streets reduced to rubble. Many of the island's architectural jewels, like its Royal Opera House, were destroyed. One convoy bringing in supplies had to turn back, never got through. 3 vessels of another convoy finally reached the port of Valletta with vital supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel. But as the Maltese dockers unloaded the vessels, the Luftwaffe attacked again. And within 72 hours, all the vessels had been sunk and most of their precious cargo destroyed. In April, on reviewing the general situation, General Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, confided to his diary. "I do not like the look of things," he wrote. "I suppose this empire has never been in such a precarious position throughout its history. I wish I could see more daylight as to how we're going to keep going through 1942. In the Middle East, in the seesaw desert war fought up and down the Libyan coastline, supplies continued to arrive to support 8th Army, led by General Ritchie. A huge base was built up in Gazala and at Tobruk, with vast supplies of fuel, rations, and ammunition. Infantry units were brought up to strength, and armored brigades were re-equipped with new tanks, including American grants. In Cairo, General Auchinleck waited for supplies to arrive, but his foe, General Rommel, was less patient. On the 26th of May, he launched an offensive at Gazala. At first, it faltered, and there was an opportunity for a counterstroke that could have smashed the German and Italian forces. But Ritchie hesitated, and by the time he attacked, Rommel had reorganized his position. By the 8th of June, 220 British tanks, including many of the American grants, had been knocked out. From London, Churchill cabled Auchinleck, saying, "Retreat would be fatal. This is a business not only of armour, but of willpower. Sadly, the necessary willpower was lacking. Ritchie ordered his main force to retreat at speed towards the Egyptian border. He relied upon the garrison at Tobruk to hold up and delay Rommel's advance. But after a fearsome air raid on the morning of Saturday, the 20th of June, German panzers penetrated the outer defences of the Libyan port. On the following afternoon, the South African commander raised the white flag of surrender. Around 33,000 Allied troops surrendered to an Axis force of about half that number. Fortress Tobruk had survived 8 months of siege in 1941, but fell to Rommel in June 1942 in a weekend. Churchill was in a meeting with President Roosevelt in the White House when news came through of the collapse at Tobruk. Churchill was overcome. He later wrote, "This was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. Not only were its military effects grievous, but it had affected the reputation of the British armies." Churchill recalled, "I did not attempt to hide from the president the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing. Disgrace is another." Across the country, faith in Churchill's leadership was crumbling. Mass observation reported that July was a month of discontent and disappointment. A 55-year-old man said, "We've made a balls of it everywhere." A middle-class woman keeping a diary for mass observation in Hampshire recorded a neighbour as saying she thought we would be under German rule here before too long. Another friend pleaded guilty to having lost faith in Churchill. In some ways, Churchill only had himself to blame. When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he'd taken over the role of Minister of Defence as well. There was no precedent for this in any British wartime experience. And it left Churchill with total control not only of the strategic decision-making in the war, but almost for every aspect of Britain's military operations around the world. Today, Churchill would be known as a micromanager. He always wanted to immerse himself in the detail of military events, so stuff that he absolutely loved. But to his generals, his admirals, and his air marshals, he was a meddler who was intervening in details that were way beyond the Prime Minister's remit. But when things went wrong, there was really no one else to blame. The responsibility for strategic failures and military disasters would ultimately always land at his feet. During the first 6 months of 1942, there were 2 hostile motions in the Commons. In January, he easily defeated a motion of no confidence. In late June, he faced a vote of censure. This was a far more serious attack upon his leadership. Aneurin Bevan, the left-wing Labour MP, summed up the mood of many with the memorable phrase, "The Prime Minister wins every debate after debate and loses battle after battle. The country's beginning to say that he fights debates like a war and the war like a debate." But despite the rhetoric, Churchill easily defeated the vote. However, in the spring of 1942, a serious political rival emerged in Sir Stafford Cripps. He was everything that Churchill wasn't. He was quite the opposite to Churchill. He was a teetotaler. He was an austere left-winger who dallied with Marxism. But in 1942, he captured the mood of the nation. He had a powerful group of what today would be called special advisors around him that became known as the Crippery. They were adept at getting their boss into the newspapers. And he was seen as being, Cripps was seen as being forward-looking, progressive, clear-minded, and super efficient. Moreover, having been ambassador in Moscow up until his return to Britain in January 1942, he became associated in the public eye with the heroic Soviet resistance to invasion, rather than Churchill, who was now becoming associated with a run of British military disasters. Mass observation identified growing public support for him, and reported he was the first alternative figure since the fall of Chamberlain. The summer and early autumn of 1942 was a precarious time for Churchill. In the Middle East, General Bernard Montgomery was appointed to command the Eighth Army and began the slow process of restoring its morale and preparing its men for a new offensive. Meanwhile, Churchill was regularly hounded out by the press. Mass observation picked up a number of reports of public support falling off the cliff. People said he'd taken on too much responsibility, that he was past it, that he was no longer the man to win the war. On the evening of 1st of October, Churchill told Sir Anthony Eden, his deputy in the Conservative Party, that if the upcoming operations in the Middle East failed, then, quote, "I'm done for and must go and hand over to one of you." A few days later, Lord Beaverbrook told Eden that Churchill was bowed, not the man he was. Churchill himself later said that for him, September and October 1942 were the two most anxious months of the war. But, as everyone knows, Montgomery and the Eighth Army delivered a great victory at Alamein. It was an intense battle that lasted nearly 2 weeks, but eventually on the 4th of November, Churchill received the message he'd long awaited. The commander-in-chief in the Middle East informed him, after 12 days of heavy and violent fighting, Eighth Army has inflicted a severe defeat on the enemy's German and Italian forces under Rommel's command. The enemy front has broken. That was what Churchill had been praying for, and it transformed the political situation. But followed 4 days later by the Anglo-American landings in French Northwest Africa, known as Operation Torch, the pendulum finally began to swing. The Prime Minister ordered the church bells to be rung. In 1940, this would have signified a German invasion. Now it celebrated a great victory. By mid-December, Churchill's political fortunes had been restored. He'd survived the gravest crisis of his leadership. This hadn't been in 1940, when the Battle of Britain had been fought, when the Blitz had generated a determined fighting spirit among many. It was, in fact, in 1942, when the run of military debacle took Britain and its war leader to the brink. Then, at last, military events turned in his favour. Military victory brought a revival of his political fortunes. As he also later wrote, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Politically secure again, Churchill would fight on for 2.5 more years, ultimately becoming the great war leader that led the nation to final victory. But 1942 was most definitely Churchill's darkest hour. Thank you for listening.